This is David Harvey, and you're listening to the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a podcast that looks at capitalism through a Marxist lens. This podcast is made possible by Democracy at Work. Just recently I had a communication which asked a question about something that I had said in a former podcast. And I had said that as capital develops, so we find ourselves increasingly ruled by abstractions. And so I was asked to talk a little bit about abstractions, what's meant by abstractions. And as usual, when you ask a question of this kind, there is a simple answer and a complicated answer, and I'm going to go halfway in between. The question of abstraction is very philosophically much debated. So I'm not going to really get into that. But what I really want to talk about is how Marx uses the notion of abstraction. And it's terribly important to him because, as he points out, you can't experiment on capital. The history of capital is just the history of capital. But what you can do is you can try to experiment by using the powers of abstraction to try to create an abstract version of exactly how capital works. And this is what, of course, Marx tries to do in Capital. But in so doing, there are various ways in which we can set up the notion of abstraction, and I want to talk about three ways because Marx uses all of them to some degree in his work, and I actually follow him in this in my own work. The first form of abstraction has been very well laid out by a colleague of mine, Bertel Ollman, who talks about scales of abstraction. And Bertel suggests that we should be very careful when working with Marx to figure out which scale he's working at. And the 5 scales he operates at are these. Firstly, there is the individual level. That is me sitting here doing things or the capitalist doing things. So there's an individual scale. The second is a scale at which we're looking at capital as it is operating in a particular place and time, like here in New York City or in Pittsburgh or in Bangladesh or wherever. So we are very much bounded by the particularities of the circumstance, but nevertheless, we are at a different level of abstraction than simply the level of individuals and their activities. So that's the second level. The third level is to talk about capital in general, which is an attempt to create a version of understanding of capital which will operate under all conditions, under all spaces and all times in which capital is dominant. So wherever capital is hegemonic and dominant, it has some characteristics that are presumably common between, say, what is going on in China, what is going on here, what is going on in Bangladesh. And so Marx is seeking to come up with an understanding of capital in general. So that's the third level at which Marx works. The fourth level is to start to think about class-divided societies, and in which case you would see capital on capitalism as just one form of class-divided societies. There have been other forms, imperial forms like Imperial China. There's discussions of Asiatic mode of production. There's a feudal mode of production. There are theocratic societies. There's ancient Rome and so on. All of them are class-divided societies, but the class configuration is very different. So we would start to see the capitalist mode of production as one mode of production of many potential modes of production, all of which are founded on class society in general. And the fifth level is humanity in general. That is there a way in which we can start to think about the collective experience of the whole of humanity? In what respects are we now actually changing the nature of what it means to be human? By way of medical advances, neurological advances, technological advances, and all the rest of it. Now, what Bertel does is to say, well, you really, when you're examining any situation, you have to think about all of those 5 levels. But some of those levels, obviously, will be more important in a particular investigation than others. And on this point, I want to sort of just suggest that there is something in terms of Marx that if you take the relationship between the particular forms that capitalism takes in different places and different times and capitalism in general, there is a kind of a way in which there is some sort of relationship between those two levels. Now, in practice, Bertel is very much about, and I would agree with him on this, he's very much about saying, well, you cannot understand any of this without actually considering all five levels simultaneously, so that we should really keep all the relations open. But the two relations I want to look at, the one relation I want to look at is between the particular level of capital and the generality of capital. Marx was seeking to set up a general view of capital, but he needed to start somewhere with a particular form of capital. And the particular form he took was the British form. And he rationalized this by saying, in effect, that the most advanced form of capital in his lifetime was the one that had been developed in Britain during the mid-19th century, and that by studying that, you were in fact studying a form of capital that would ultimately become general, that all societies could look at the British model and, in a sense, see their own future in what was occurring in Britain in the middle of the 19th century. So Marx did that for a couple of reasons. Firstly, he was very well aware of what was going on in Britain, because that was where he was living and that was what he was experiencing in terms of his daily life. The other thing, two other things that were important to him were this. Engels was very close to the ground in terms of how capital was working in Manchester. Now, this is important because Manchester capitalism was a specific form of capitalism, even in Britain at that time. So Engels, by talking about Manchester capitalism, was in fact taking a particular place in a particular time and using it as a kind of way to gather evidence in terms of what capital in general might look like, not only in the present, but also in the future. The second thing was that in Britain, as opposed to most other parts of the world, there was a vast trove of evidence as to what was going on in industrial capitalism. And this vast trove of evidence arose out of, not in this case Engels, but rose out of somebody called Leonard Horner, who was one of the factory inspectors. And Marx used the factory inspectors' reports to the Parliament and the parliamentary inquiries into the state of British capitalism. Now, there's a vast trove of information there. And if you read something like Marx's chapter on the working day in Volume 1 of Capital, it is dominated by the evidence that is collected by the factory inspectors and all of the parliamentary reports. And Marx at some point or other kind of said, well, it is amazing that the British state has amassed this huge amount of data in terms of the conditions prevailing in the factories and in the mines and in the fields and all the rest of it, compared to other societies like Germany or France and so on. And there was a very interesting reason why this was so. And it had a lot to do, actually, characteristically, with the class configuration in Britain at that time. There was a residual class of landed aristocracy. They were still extremely powerful in British politics. They were gradually being usurped, if you like, by the industrial capital. And it was the industrial capitalists of Manchester versus the landed aristocracy. And there was a lot of rivalry going on there. For example, the landed aristocracy was largely living off land rents, and land rents were very much connected to the price of agricultural commodities. And the primary commodity that was attached to was wheat, or as was said, corn in Britain. And now wheat, of course, goes into bread. So the price of bread is very much affected by the price of wheat. And wheat in cultivation in Britain was protected, because that protected the incomes of the landed aristocracy. So there were tariffs on imported wheat. And there therefore was a big political struggle in the middle of the 19th century over the corn laws, as they were called. That was the laws over wheat importation. The Manchester faction wanted cheap corn because that meant cheap bread, which meant you could lower the wages of workers. The landed aristocracy wanted protection because that was their incomes coming from the land. So there was a big struggle over this. And the landed aristocracy fought a battle and was antagonistic to the workers. And in the end, there was a repeal of the Corn Laws, as they were called in Britain at the time. And that meant cheap wheat could come into the country from Eastern Europe and from North America. And that meant that you could lower the price of bread and you could lower wages. And of course, the Manchester industrialists were very content. On the other hand, what this did was eventually to plunge British agriculture into general depression, and wheat cultivation became, wheat prices were down. And this really seriously hurt the economic status of the landed aristocracy. The landed aristocracy, therefore, wanted to get back at the industrial aristocracy. So one of the things they did was to start to question the practices of the industrialists, and that was what got set up in Parliament, while all these inquisitions into what was going on in terms of industrial activity in Manchester and the like. So there was a factional struggle, if you like, between the landed aristocracy and the industrialists, and the industrialists got their free trade, got lower wheat prices. The landed aristocracy took the revenge by going to the working class and kind of saying to the workers, look, you're being repressed by the industrialists. So there was an alliance then formed between landed aristocrats and the working class to try to put restrictions on and therefore we get the Factory Acts and the reform of industrialist practices. So this is what was going on at the time. So Marx was kind of saying, if there's this vast trove of information which is available in Britain at this time over exactly what is happening in the factories, down in the mines and in the fields, and I can use this trove of information to talk about the characteristics of industrial capitalism as it is in its most advanced form. Now, the thing was that Marx was taken with Manchester, and Manchester was about cotton factories, large-scale industrial textile production. And most of the evidence that Marx had was about Manchester industrialism. So Marx was taking Manchester industrialism and using it as a template to understand the general character of capital, not only in the present, but also what it would look like in the future. But it turns out that in Britain, there were many different forms of capitalism. If Engels' family had a business in Birmingham, for example, they would have ended up with a very different picture of exactly what the industrial activity was about, because Birmingham was a very different kind of capitalist economy. It was mainly concerned with not cotton manufacture and all the rest of it, but was concerned with mechanical engineering. And Manchester was the place that produced the steam engine. Birmingham was the place that produced the steam engines. Birmingham was the place that produced a lot of the new technologies and the new technical machinery and so on that was coming out. Birmingham was the place where in the end, engines were constructed and so on. And it had a different kind of there were a lot of small-scale enterprises also in Birmingham that got together in what are called agglomeration districts and producing very specific kinds of products. For example, most of the guns which were used in the United States in the first part of the 19th century were made in Birmingham. And there was a whole quarter of Birmingham that was given over to producing, guns and inventing new forms of guns and so on. So this was a very different kind of industrial setup. And in that setup, the kind of labor you needed in Birmingham was semi-skilled. I mean, not skilled in the old artisan sense, but skilled at engineering. and in engineering innovation and so on. Whereas the kind of labor you needed in the cotton factories was a kind of sort of rote labor, and the power loom weaver was a very different kind of laborer compared to the more skilled workers that were needed in Birmingham manufacturing. So there were these radical differences from one place to another. You have Birmingham industrialism and you have Manchester industrialism. And I think that Capital as a book would have looked rather different had Marx focused on Birmingham industrialism. And so there was Marx talking about that particular level of a particular scale and generalizing from that scale. Now, the question then was, well, was the generality that he came up with significant? Well, in certain parts of the world today, you would read the chapter on the working day, you would read the reports of the factory inspectors on what is going on in Manchester industry. You would read all of that. And if you went off to Bangladesh and you went into the textile factories of Bangladesh, you really wouldn't notice the difference. Indeed, Marx was correct when he kind of said, you see the image of your own future. But the image of the future was what the factory system would look like into the future. And that was this factory system of Manchester, which is now available to look at if you go to Bangladesh or if you go to southern provinces of China and some of the textile factories that are working in that part of the world. So that was true. But then the question is, well, in what ways is that going to be able to talk about capital in general? Because capital in general right now includes not only Bangladesh, but Silicon Valley. It includes other forms of capital. And so we have the particularities of capitalism, which are still with us. You have Marx taking the generality from the Manchester model and trying to generalize it in very, very synthetic terms. And he did a good job of it. And I think he recognized at a certain point that he was too much focused on the Manchester model, and he tried to broaden it by looking at, what was going on in France and what was going on in other industrial areas. And therefore, the model he came up with of capital in general was broader than simply the Manchester model, but nevertheless, I think it's important always to read Capital, particularly Capital Volume 1, in the light of the fact that Marx is talking about the Manchester model of capital, not necessarily talking about the Birmingham model of capital. And interestingly on this, there is a fascinating little book by a guy called John Foster called Class Struggle and Industrial Revolution. And what Foster does is to look at the industrial structure of three cities in Britain during the early part of the 19th century. Oldham, which is very close to Manchester and which is a typical Manchester kind of city. Northampton, which was a shoemaking city, but very, very different in industrial structure. And South Shields up in the northeast, which was about shipbuilding and the like. What Foster does is to say these three different industrial structures gave you very, very different political reactions. And he's particularly interested in the subjectivity of labor coming out of the factory experience of Oldham, the factory systems in Northampton, shoemaking in Northampton, and shipbuilding and shipping in South Shields. And what this came down to was that in Oldham you had a very articulate working class emerging out of the factory system. And this, of course, is one of Marx's points, that the factory system would generate a proletariat, which would begin to see that it had certain power and start to assemble and create a collective power. And in Oldham, they started to set up relations between the factory workers and the municipal government, and you start to see the emergence of a kind of municipal socialism in Oldham because of the nature of the class consciousness and the structure of the working class. In Northampton, that didn't happen. And in South Shields, that didn't happen because there you have disparate kind of working systems and radically different. So that, again, the general argument that is often made that we're going to get a massification of the proletariat through industrialization, and that massive proletariat is going to become class conscious and is going to create an alternative society. where you would see that happening, or beginning to happen, in the textile mills of Manchester and Oldham and so on. But you didn't see that happening in industrial areas elsewhere. And I think this is, again, a very important point to kind of say that the class consciousness that arises depends very much on the nature of the industrial structure and the nature of capitalism. So Marx was trying to abstract from all of the particularity and to create a general model, to move to a general model of what a capitalist mode of production was about. But it was based upon the experience of these very particular forms of capital. And therefore, to some degree or other, I think we have to recognize that Marx's presentation of the general theory of capital is a little bit biased towards the Manchester model versus the other models which coexisted. So when we're talking about the scales, I think it's very important, therefore, to look at the relationship between the scales and how we understand the capitalist mode of production as a mode of production distinctive from other modes of production via the generality which comes out of the experience of all of these local forms that capital took. So that's the first level of abstraction, which is important to look at. And therefore, when I'm reading Marx, I'm always kind of saying, well, what is he generalizing about? And where is this information coming from? And of course, the factory inspectors weren't only active in Manchester, they were also active in Birmingham and elsewhere. So some of what Marx is picking up in terms of the conditions of life and labor in Britain at the time is general to Britain as a whole. But nevertheless, as I'm arguing, the Manchester experience or the particularity of that enters into the way in which Marx sets up the general model of a capitalist mode of production. So that's the first system, if you like. The second form of abstraction, which I want to point out, is what I would call perspective from which you're looking. The way I argue this is to say, well, imagine that you're in the fifth floor of a building, and you're looking out onto a square. And from that fifth floor in that building, you describe everything that you can see going on in that square. And you do it very accurately, close observation. And you therefore end up with a picture of what is going on in the square and what the square is about and what the square contains. But then suppose that somebody in the fifth story of a building on the south side of the park or whatever, the square, is also doing the same thing and gives a detailed description of what they see in the square from their perspective. And then somebody on the east side and somebody on the west side does the same thing. Now, you would all end up with what might be called objective descriptions of what is seen from a particular perspective. But what is in the square is really going to be understood only through the very different perspectives of the four windows upon which you're looking upon the square. And somebody on the south side will see all kinds of things that you can't see from the north side and the west side and the east side and so on. So this is, therefore, the perspective is terribly important. Now, this comes through to Marx in the following way, that Marx is interested in capital's perspective on the world. But again, the capitalist perspective, again, from a mini perspective. Volume 1 of Capital is about the perspective of production, after the sort of introductory stuff and the stuff at the end about primitive accumulation and so on. The core of Volume 1 is about production. And you understand how production works. And the whole description there, however, has no mention whatsoever of land rent and landlords or finance capital and so on. There's nothing about that at all. It's the perspective of production. The second volume of Capital is the perspective of circulation. It's about going to market and how the capital circulates in general through the different positions and comes back and the like. So it's about circulation. So the first volume is a perspective of production. The second is the perspective of circulation. The third is the contradictions which exist between production and circulation, and also about distribution. So there we get the theory of rent, landed aristocracy, the theory of merchant capital, and banking, and all the rest of it. And so capital as a work is arranged around three different perspectives, or actually four different perspectives. The perspective of production, perspective of circulation, the perspective of distribution, and the perspective of the contradictory relations between all of them. Now, this is, if you like, the perspective position. And what I say to people is, people often read Capital Volume 1 and say, well, okay, I've understood capital. You say, no, you haven't understood capital. You've understood capital from a certain perspective. Marx's perspective of how capital is organizing production. Marx's perspective of how it's organizing circulation in Volume 2. So I say to people, if you really want to understand capital, you've got to read the whole 3 volumes, which is very distressing because Volume 2 is rather boring and Volume 3 is rather incoherent. But the point here is that again, Marx's abstraction is very important. And he says that's what he's doing. In Volume 1, at a certain point, he says, I am treating this as if the questions of distribution don't matter, as if questions of circulation don't matter. I'm just treating it from the standpoint of production. So there's a standpoint in the theorizing. Now, in general, what Marx is doing, however, is viewing capital from capital's perspective. And this is very important to understand, because I often find when I'm talking about what Marx does is that people attribute something to Marx or to me in terms of that I don't believe, for example, that nature really matters. It's a free gift. I don't believe that at all. But Marx says, well, that's how capital approaches nature. And capital approaches nature and it approaches social reproduction and it doesn't care. Just like the workers take care of their own social reproduction, basically, the capitalist says, I'm not interested in what they do. They can do what they like. As long as they come into work next day, that's all I'm interested in. So again, what Marx does is to say, from the perspective of capital, social reproduction and the metabolic relation to nature, yes, they're important in general, but in terms of the capitalist mode of production, they are not foundational or not fundamental. And that doesn't mean that I think that social reproduction is irrelevant or that the relation to nature is irrelevant. In fact, very different. I'm very, very concerned about the fact that capital doesn't really give a hoot about social reproduction. Capital does not in itself give a hoot about what is happening to the natural world. I care a lot about both of those things, and in that sense, I think capital is very defective because it has refrained from taking those questions seriously. And over time, of course, what we've seen is that institutions have grown up in society, laws have grown up in society, which force capital to some degree to take environmental questions seriously, which force capital to take questions of social reproduction rather seriously. And capital at a certain point realizes that it needs to take some of those aspects seriously. For example, I mentioned the Birmingham example of industrialism in Britain at that time. That was a very good example where capital needed some level of skilled labor. Therefore, capital, at a certain point in Birmingham, started to set up public education. So they set up public education because they needed trained engineering skills in the kind of workshops that were emerging in the place. You didn't need that so much in Manchester, so you didn't find that going on in Manchester. In Birmingham, to a degree you needed a bit of a skilled labor force. You wanted to make sure they stayed in town and didn't go to the United States or go to Europe or whatever. So you had to pay them somewhat more. And you had to make life reasonably important to them. So you paid attention to conditions of social reproduction. So you start to find a concern with social housing in Birmingham, even during Marx's time, because decent housing, education, starts to be important in the formation of a working class which is capable of operating skillfully in the kinds of industrial structures that existed. So this, too, is also, well, what does capital take seriously? During Marx's time, capital of the Manchester sort didn't care a hoot about pollution problems or environmental questions at all. capital of Manchester time didn't care a hoot about questions of social reproduction. The workers just got on with it and bred kids and bred labor and all of that kind of thing. And that's as far as capital went. But again, there's a certain bias in Marx in terms of sort of saying, well, to the degree that capital didn't take those questions seriously, I'm going to create a model of capital which doesn't take those issues seriously and treats the free gifts of nature as if it is full of free gifts, treats social reproduction as if it just works to the benefit of capital, and that is that. So the perspective then is very important. Now, Marx's perspective throughout is to try to get inside what might be called the working mechanism, the heart and the core and the essence of what capital is about. And from that basis, you can start, therefore, to see the emergence of the third level of abstraction, which we're going to look at. So we have the first level, which is the scale, the second level, which is the question of perspective. The third level is within capital itself. How does capital create abstractions to which everybody who is engaged with capital is forced to comply? And this is a much more complex kind of story. It goes something like this. We start with the commodity. I look at a situation and I see commodity exchange going on. I go into a supermarket and people say to me, what's going on? Well, people are exchanging things, money for commodities. All of the things you see in a supermarket are very different qualities and use values and all the rest of it, but they have this in common that they have all been produced for exchange. And the exchange is such that people want the commodity and need the commodity, and they're going to use it. So we start then with the concept of the commodity, and that's what Marx calls a concrete abstraction. The concrete abstraction continues when we say, well, what goes on with the commodity? The commodity has an exchange value, because that's what you pay for it in the supermarket. It has a use value, because that's what you do with it when you take the commodity home. So we can start, therefore, again, at the level of concrete abstraction, start to talk about the commodity as a use value and exchange value. But then we ask a sort of question, well, how come that commodity costs twice as much as this other commodity? And the answer is there must be something going on there which is common to all commodities. What is it? And this is where we move from the concrete abstractions, which are of the sort that I've already described, to theoretical abstraction. Well, they must have something in common, we say. What is that commonality they have? Well, Marx's answer is they're all products of human labor. Therefore, what they have in common is that they are products of human labor. Therefore, it is labor input which is involved. And then you kind of say concretely, all right, well, let's see. And you go back and you find this person takes 12 hours to make a pair of shoes. This person makes a pair of shoes in 6 hours. And you say, well, in that case, they should exchange in the rate that, well, if you get the shoes from this person, you pay 12 hours equivalent of labor, and this person 6 hours. No, says Marx. In the market, it's all rendered equal, so that there is something called socially necessary labor time as opposed to labor time. That is a theoretical abstraction. And Marx then says, so we start to work now with theoretical abstractions. Those theoretical abstractions are built step by step into a whole kind of theory of exactly how a capitalist mode of production works. Under the coercive laws of competition, for example, all capitalists find themselves in competition with other capitalists, and that capitalist who has a superior technology is likely to drive out of business the other capitalists which have inferior technologies. So therefore, there is always a pursuit of a technological edge, new technologies. And this is, again, therefore, the coercive laws of competition force capitalists to be very concerned with the kind of technology which they use and to seek out technological advantage wherever they possibly can. Now, this is an abstraction. So therefore, we're saying that actually capitalists are not free to do what they want. They cannot, spend hours and hours and hours on something when somebody else spends minutes on it. They cannot do that. They are forced by the logic of the system. The abstraction is created by competition between individual capitalists, creating a standard to which all capitalists must comply. And that starts to be, if you like, the concrete abstraction, which becomes the theoretical abstraction, which starts to dominate capitalist behavior. Capitalists start to behave in such a way that they start to become entrepreneurs who are constantly seeking out technological advantage relative to other capitalists. And this is one of the rules of the game within capitalism, that your technology has to be better than everybody else's if you're going to survive. So this is, if you like, one of the rules. Now, Marx is very emphatic about these rules. And lest you think it's only Marx who is emphatic about it, I remind you that Adam Smith talked about the hidden hand of the market. And basically he said the hidden hand of the market determines and fixes things. And that therefore it doesn't really matter why individuals do what they do, because the hidden hand of the market in the end is going to be determining what happens. So again, this is where the abstraction comes in. The price of something is fixed by the market. And to the degree that prices go up or go down, it is not within individuals' ability to affect prices. I mean, this is one of the theses that is very important in Adam Smith, that individuals cannot affect market prices. A purely functioning market is one in which the market price is established through the actions of multiple individuals all coming to market with the same commodity and finding that, therefore, there is, at a certain point, a kind of natural price of their product and recognizing that they have to produce to meet that natural price if they're going to gain a profit. So that is, if you like, the kind of rule which is set up. So this abstraction is the kind of abstraction that is going to regulate how we are. The same is true in terms of wage rates. For example, it's not as if I can go in or an individual capitalist can go in and just say, well, we'll pay any old wage. No. There's a going wage rate. Where does the going wage rate come from? It comes from, again, the class relation which exists between capital and labor. And this class relation is one which is a very, very important force which is going to determine how the value of labor power actually works in a given society in a given time. So these are the abstractions which begin to emerge in a capitalist society. And as we get more and more complicated in terms of understanding how the dynamics of a capitalist society work, so those abstractions become more and more dominant in terms of exactly what we have to comply to. At the international level, for example, those abstractions are enforced through various institutional arrangements. For example, there's a World Trade Organization, and you have to abide by certain rules in order and join the World Trade Organization. And those rules are abstract rules. So when China joined the World Trade Organization in 2000 and 2001, it found itself having to obey the rules of a world of capital accumulation. And to the degree that it had to do that, it therefore found itself unable to freely choose exactly what it was going to do. It had to negotiate, if you like, with the laws of motion of capital. And in negotiating with the laws of motion of capital, it found itself stuck with certain definitions of wage rate and all the rest of it. So the abstract rules which get set up through capital, as capital sets them up, are very powerful in terms of regulating what happens in terms of the prices of things, of the interest rate, and all of those kinds of things. So the abstractions which come to dominate us are those which capital creates in the course of its own evolution and its own becoming and its own structures. And I will be talking a lot about that on the next occasion.
Thank you for joining me today. You've been listening to David Harvey's Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a Democracy at Work production. A special thank you to the wonderful Patreon community for supporting this project.